All right, my name's Timothy Honnell. We're teaching at Eastwood College today, doing a presentation on EGR valves. So what is an EGR valve? Anybody know? Anybody have any clues at all? What's the EGR stand for? All right, exhaust gas recirculation. I put a PowerPoint up here today. It says all the grass is dead. So what do you think about that? What do you think? Why do you think all the grass is dead, Osvaldo? All the emissions. What kind of emissions does the EGR take care of? Anybody know that question? No? Well, that's good. That's why we're here today.
No, not touching the gas. The gas fumes.
CO, and there's one other gas that's responsible for it. Not hydrocarbons. We'll talk about it here in just a second. All right. The EGR valve has tons of problems since the beginning of the time. Fix it, fix it, fix it. The purpose of the EGR valve is exhaust gas recirculation, which is exactly what it says. It actually takes the gases from the exhaust and it recirculates them up through the valve to where? Anybody know where it's going to mount it at? Pipe 2? Pipe back 2? The intake manifold. So it actually takes the exhaust, runs it up through a valve, and then back through the intake manifold. And I'm going to draw a picture of it here in just a second. It reduces the NOx gas. That's one of the most important things that it does. When you go to an inspection center or state inspection center or anything like that, it actually reduces the amount of NOx that actually comes through the system. And the NOx is going to be the big grass killer. On the PowerPoint display before this, it actually showed back in the early 70s and 60s, all the grass all the way up down the highways and the streets, everything was dead because of all the fumes, the dangerous and toxic fumes that the NOx gas gives off. There's really not any other way other than the NOx is taken away from the catalytic converter. But if you have one that fails, that comes in on the test, I would say 80 to 90% of the time, I would look at the cat, but the cat, it's kind of hard to test, but I would always look at the EGR system first to see if that NOx gas, if it's taking care of that NOx gas there. So when I say that, what I'm saying pre-OBD2, 1996 back to as far back as you can go before you hit the 25-year limit, because on state inspections you have your 25-year limit, which is safety only, and then between that and 1996, which is not that big a window anymore, when you have to do the diamond test, that's the gas that it's looking for is the NOx there. Everything after 1996, of course, is OBD2, where you can actually have the service engine lights on when something's malfunctioning, and you don't pick that up if a cat's not working right or whatever else. So it works by recirculating a portion of the engine's exhaust back through the cylinders, so it actually reburns it through the intake up into the cylinders there. And then the recycling does cause the loss of engine efficiency. So when this began back in the 1970s, and we're going to talk about that here in just a second, what do you think the people did, the old farmer Joe that's sitting out in the fields, what kind of reaction do you think they had to the EGR valve when it first came out?
Hated it.
Hated it. So what did they usually do with it? Took it off. Take it off. Let's cut a metal plate out of a Coke can. That's what you did. You got a side of a Coke can, cut it out with some tin snips, and put it between the EGR valve and that, and just pressured it off. Because you lost engine efficiency doing that. So, and 1973, the EGR was when it was big on the scene. Before most of us were born, it was on the scene, and that's when it became a big deal. Chrysler's first EGR valve was coolant control, which meant that it was actually, the coolant would actually monitor the coolant until the coolant got warm, and then when it opened it up and allowed the EGR valve to start working. Because those gases and stuff were really not a major factor until the engine got warm to a certain point. The EGR is controlled by vacuum. They're all controlled by a vacuum tube, usually a vacuum solenoid, a separate vacuum solenoid. The new ones today, how can they be controlled? Electronic. They're all electronically controlled, that kind of stuff. And so, the Ford DPFE and position sensor was the Ford's style there. All right. The typical EGR valve, this is how they all looked on the old 350s. They had a EGR valve, which is the whole unit here. It shows the exhaust gas where it actually come through this pencil up and through here, cycle through. Number 3, right here is where they would come back into the intake. So the gas would come up here, back through the intake, And number 4 was the vacuum port up there on the top where the little nipple comes out right there. You could actually, through the vacuum pull and open the diaphragm up. And 5 is the diaphragm. It's kind of a spring top diaphragm. You can actually push it by hand too. If you can see your finger in there and push it up if you wanted to too. Now we'll get one out when we go to the shop. Number 6 is the air bleed hold. 7 small spring, 8 large spring. And so that was the basic general when they came out in '73. That's what most of them look like if you look at an old 350 or old engine, something like that. All right. Ford could never make an EGR valve that worked properly. Seriously. They still, the whole entire time from 1973 to currently, they still haven't got it right. They tried. Every model that they made was just junk. And we made millions, the technicians made millions of dollars off their mistakes. The 5 liter, everybody familiar with the old 5 liter that they ran in the trucks, or 4.9s? They all had the same type of setup. This was sat on the side of the intake like this, and on the top it had a sensor on the top. You can see up there, it's the EGR valve position sensor. And as this was commanded on, that sensor up top would tell exactly with the little shaft, it could tell exactly how far it was open. Terrible design, never worked right, caused major problems all the time. The sensor would be bad, the exhaust flow into the intake manifold, it gets stuck right there, it would be leaking intake manifold, or it'd be leaking exhaust into it the whole time. Just a terrible design, lots of money, we replaced tons of them. You can see the actual flow here, how it worked on here. All right. The next one. The solenoid to the EGR valve, almost all these look alike. They're all just a 2-wire when you have power and ground, and they can either power, with power to turn on or ground. And then one would go to the EGR valve, and then one would vacuum. So this would be vacuum all the time. You would turn it on, and it would actually suck back into the EGR valve to open it up. Everybody clear on that? Okay. Next. DPFE, that was a killer. If you ever have one that has like a PO401 or something like that, a code, the DPFE's code, that was the #1 thing that we replaced almost every Ford vehicle. Some were aluminum, some were plastic. I've never seen a Ford to come in that didn't have it replaced. So either you replace it or somebody else replaced it with a newer model. They were a terrible design. What they did was actually, go ahead and look on the next one. Leave it on the next one. The DPFE stands for Delta Pressure Feedback EGR Sensor. The purpose is to measure the exhaust gas flow from the purpose of controlling the flow to the engine. It reports, who does it report to, the flow? PCM, excellent. PCM. It reports back to the PCM, and the 401 and 402 are the most common codes, and I say money, because they're about $30, and we did gazillions of them. We knew it came in, that's exactly what it did. The 2 things you have to check is the 2 lines. One of them, they come into the exhaust there, the actual feedback lines to make sure that they're clear. Because anytime you're dealing with EGR, you're also dealing with carbon. Carbon's a major factor that you're going to get from the engine. So carbon could have some buildup, but I would say out of 100%, 95% of the time it was a bad valve, and 5% of the time it maybe some carbon or something was restricting the flow. The PCM couldn't read it in there. They use this to actually turn it on and off. They're the only people that ever had anything that to my knowledge, they're the only car manufacturer that had anything like that. And so it was a total failure, and they finally, after about 10 years, got rid of it. So, all right. Chevy became a close second place for failure as far as UGRs. The Road Monster, you know what a Road Monster is? It's actually a Roadmaster. We used to call them Road Monsters. And so they're actually like a big Buick. They're Buick's huge freaking cars. They're massive. And they had a 570 on an awesome freaking motor. And it was about the time, do you remember the SS Impalas?
Yeah.
All right, it was the same car,
Yeah, just a station wagon.
same setup, but yeah, they had a station, but they had a 4-door sedan too. And we call them Road Monsters because they were huge, but they were awesome cars. But they kind of floated around. And when I was at the Buick dealership, they had the 5.7. You got the Blazers with the 5.7, like your truck. You have a truck that's similar to that. The white truck has the same setup. It's got the EGR system. As a matter of fact, we can bring it in today, but it has the EGR system here. And 3 things. The biggest thing is the tip-in acceleration. usually what you'd have is if you had a slight tip in and give it a little bit of gas, it'd kind of fall on its face. And that was the biggest thing that they had an issue with in all the 90s. If just a slight, when I say tip in, you're giving the throttle just a little bit and it would just go, whoop, it would kind of fall down, chug, and then it'd pick back up and take back off again. That was one of the biggest things. And then two, when you replace them, they have a washer on the bottom, and it would come with like 50 different washers if you ever have to replace one. And you're gonna make sure that it has the right washer. You put the right washer in there so it gets the correct flow. If not, it'll set a code. And the code back then in the 90s, we had like probably, I don't know, 30, 40 codes. I think the code was a 32 that set the EGR valve, and then you pretty much immediately know that's what it is. So, any questions there? So far, I'm covering them pretty quick. Okay, let's go to the next one. All right, the 4.3 Vortec carbon issues. This motor right here, has anybody ever seen one of these V6s? It has a little black plastic with a fluorescent orange Vortec on there. The Blazer, the little S10 Blazer, the S10 pickups, they all use this motor. It was an awesome motor. It was very strong. The biggest issue that this motor had was carbon buildup right here in this pencil. This was an electronic EGR valve. Carbon rocks would like float around inside the intake, and they would sit like a tornado. And then a carbon rock would get stuck in here and open this EGR valve about 70%. What do you think would happen when that opened it up?
Too much flow in.
When it opened it all the way up, what would it cause?
Loss of vacuum.
Loss of vacuum. And then what would you feel if you were the driver possibly?
Power.
Major power loss. What else would you lose with no vacuum?
Brakes.
Brakes. I remember when I was driving back from with my mother, she had a red, everybody had a Blazer then when they came out there, and they're awesome. People still love them, 2 doors and 4 doors. This little 4-door, we were driving back from Missouri from a family reunion, and a rock got caught up in there about 70%. If you're doing highway speed, it was no big deal. You didn't really notice as much. But at that low speed, it was just, it sounded like it had a huge cam in it. It was like, joke. I mean, we just sit at a light and just sit there and the whole thing would just shake. You wouldn't have any brakes, and it just barely idle. And it would do that, and there's no way that we could get that rock out. What are some of the ways you could get the rock out?
Pick it up and clean it.
Pull the EGR valve off. It took about 5 minutes, and you could stick a pocket screwdriver in there, and there'd be a rock just stuck in there about like that. And it did it all the time. This wasn't the first time. It did it multiple times. And what would be another way to get it out pretty easier than that?
Could you put a screen on it?
Think of the CAN network, even though I didn't have CAN. Think of stuff that we've been doing in the shop.
Using the arrows.
With the scan tool, is excellent. It's a scan tool. You could actually, on these particular EGR valves, and even on ones today, you can open them up 10%, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. You can open up to 100%. So when you get up to that 100%, you can open up that rock we use to slide through or burn out. So, but the carbon was a major issue. At one point in time, they were talking about, and I'm not sure if they ever mastered it, but putting a screen in there, you could decarbon the engines. It didn't matter. This engine was just a carbon monster. And so these were issues that it had. So if you have that motor, or if you ever pull up on one, going a little bit off, there's 2 problems that this motor had. One was that, which was terrible, and the other one was spider injectors. They're like a unit like this, and with your fuel rail, your fuel would actually come in, your fuel injection, to your fuel pressure, and then it had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and these were little hoses that went, these were underneath the intake. And a lot of times this fuel pressure regulator right here on the square box would actually leak fuel, and it would fill the entire intake up with gas. So when you started it up, it could be a walking time bomb is what it looked like. It's like solid gas inside there. It could explode at any time, but it would usually start up and run like crap for a long time. It would sit there and pour out and leak, and they had major problems. So those 2 things are the major factors in that. But back to the EGR valve, this is probably the worst design they ever had. It was just bad news. But they still use this for a long time. It's still real common. So, but they got rid of the motor was the carbon problem at that time. All right, let's go to the next one. Crosser issues. Some of the town and countries, on the back side of the crosser issue, on the back side of the intake, they had some EGR valves, not too bad though. Overall, they're pretty good. The rest of the car usually falls apart. Some of y'all work at Dodge know that. In other words, all the money was spent on research of the EGR while the transmissions department was neglected. So that was my joke for the day. All right, let's end next one. Variable valve timing. Variable valve timing is where it's at today. What did they do with variable valve timing? Well, I'll put it on the top there. What does it do? It eliminates the EGR problem. So they take the EGR, once again, and the more we get through this class, you're learning like the throttle positioning, the auto air control disappeared. Things are starting to disappear the way we used to do them in the old days, and we're replacing with new technology. Is it a good thing?
Yeah. Sometimes.
Sometimes. What we talked about yesterday, what did I have that comparison to? Confusion is equal to what?
Money.
Money. So this right here, major confusion. The variable valve timing, the VVT is what it's commonly called, can control the timing of the exhaust valve so that the right amount of inert gases remain in the combustion chamber for the next cycle. High NOx to make sure this is working properly. The Trailblazer, dirty oil, vibration kicks to the next one. I'm going to show you why I have those last three on there. All right, the Trailblazer. This whipped my butt earlier in the year. My wife drives a 06 Trailblazer. And it was running like crap. It ran like an EGR valve stuck open, really. And it vibrated, the whole thing vibrated like, whoa, the service engine light was coming on, all kind of issues. Well, on the exhaust, you can actually see there's a variable valve timing setup. They all look pretty similar to this. Instead of having the EGR valve, it has a sensor that sits in there, and then actually the sensor's about this long, and it has a photo eye on there. And when the oil gets dirty, it quits reading, or it gives it a false reading. And it makes that side open up all the way on the exhaust side. And so, major issues. My wife come home complaining, I can't fix the car. All it was a simple brake clean and cleaning off that switch and changing the oil. I let the oil go farther than I should, and the oil got real dirty. It couldn't read right. Here we go. Start all back over again. So, I ended up replacing that sensor later on. It just got to the point where it just wasn't reading right all the time, and it caused that. But there's an actual picture of it too, and you can see that it can adjust the exhaust valve there. All right, so the variable valve timing is where everything probably, when we go to the shop here in a little bit, everything seems to be going today. And but so a lot of it, the new Chrysler, you know what, 3.6, what was it called? Pentastar. It's one of the most common ones. I mean, one of the newest, most popular ones on the market right now. Where it's, but once again, a lot of confusion there. A lot of people don't want to deal with it. Who's done a timing belt on a variable valve timing motor? Anybody? Some of the old Ford Escorts and stuff started using it back in the day. Those ZX2s or whatever those things were. And there's a little confusion there. Because what happens to your timing gears? Anybody know? Well, think about variable valve timing. What do you think your timing gears would do? They move. Not only is a timing belt hard enough to put on anyway and line up with the marks, now you got one that moves. So there's special tools that hold it still. You need to line it up. You need to do this and that. At the very beginning, we're like, what in the world? You know what I mean? Like, it was already difficult enough. Now you're going to add this part to it. So there's more moving parts. I looked at that. I encourage you to go on and look at the image of that Pentastar motor. It's pretty wild looking. I looked at it a little bit last night. It's a pretty sophisticated piece of machinery. I mean, some of the stuff that's going on inside the engine, it's pretty awesome stuff. So I think it's pretty neat. All right, so if we have an EGR problem, when we go to the shop here, we're going to go here in just a second. What's step one? What should we do? Customer brings it in. It's running like crap. What do we do? What's it? Yeah, I said check engine lights on. We grab a scan tool, and then what do we do?
You pull up the codes.
Pull up the codes. All right, then what?
Locate the EGR.
Search for the code, what the code is,
Yeah, search for the code, do what?
and like, see what it is.
See what it is. All right, verify it. Okay. And then we go to do what after that?
Exit.
Fix it. There's one other step though. So we got the scanner, we hook it up, we search for what the code is, and then what we can do after that.
You can look up the
You can clear
TSBs.
code.
Yeah, we can look up TSBs, or we can go to the computer and go over there. Before you clear codes, don't get too caught up in that yet.
Yeah, okay.
Because you start clearing codes and man, it won't come back and you're lost. You
Yeah.
figure out what the code is.
Okay.
But maybe go over to Mitchell or Identifix and let's print out a diagram or trouble tree of what's going on. But today we're going to go out there, maybe we'll set some EGR codes. Let's try to find one on the CAN network that we can actually rotate it all the way up and all the way down. bring it up and bring it down. And when we bring it up, let's see what it runs like, because it's gonna sound like it has a can, and it's gonna be throaty, like whoop, 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 sit there and chug. And then, well, the reason I'll say to do that is because, I want you to get a feel, to hear, you know, start listening to what it sounds like, because you're gonna have one pull on the drive, and you'll know immediately that's what it is, so. All right, y'all about ready?